Welcome to Ask the Rabbi, Volume 7. We should have a class called Don't Be Rude to the Rabbi. There's somebody in my earlier class this morning who just hopped on and started blathering nonsense. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. I think here we go. Okay, so let's go to some of our questions. So there's some questions that are in the chat, some that are out of the chat. Let's talk about some interesting ones that are all over the place. Okay, so let's talk about some interesting questions that have both been presented in here and ones that I have received orally. So here's some fun stuff. Okay, so one question I had, this is kind of interesting. Question is, someone gives a rabbi gives you a ruling, but it's not your rabbi. You ask your rabbi goes and asks another rabbi, and he comes back to you and gives you a decision. Is that ruling binding on you? Okay, so the answer generally for that is yes. The way that it works is you approach the rabbi, you ask them for an opinion, and when you accept it and you follow through on it, you are now bound by that decision, whatever it is. Let's say another rabbi hears about it, and he believes that it is an error. So, what can you do? There's a couple different things. If it involves money, and you believe you'll be saving somebody from a loss of money, you can go ahead and take a stand on it. If a decision was rendered orally, you can basically challenge the basis upon which it was based. Perhaps you didn't hear it correctly. Perhaps this was not correct. Perhaps. And all in the benefit of the people doing it. Some people can come get the psak, they can get the decision back and say, I don't think this is correct, and they can ask somebody else. However, the Talmud is very clear that one is not permitted to simply go ahead and reverse someone else's ruling once they have made a ruling on it, unless they have made a graven error in black letter law. So in those cases, those type of rulings generally flip-flop. Now, those rulings are no longer binding on them, even if it's if it's money, you get the money back. If it revolves around the kashrut status of something, you won't be able to necessarily charge them with some type of financial loss unless you've paid them or they're considered an expert and they've failed in that capacity. For example, a shochet, you've asked them if the shechita was good and they told you it was not good, and then somebody else comes over and says, listen, I saw the knife, I saw the this, I saw the that, and you're wrong. You're wrong. Or you bring two witnesses, right? So in those cases, it would be different. So it's really kind of interesting how those type of rules interact, how they work. So, but otherwise, you're not supposed to overturn it unless you think unless another rabbi, if you ask another rabbi and they think that based on the information presented that they've made a terrible error. Another question that was kind of interesting someone asked me about is if you need to ride the elevator. Let's say you rent a place and you need to ride an elevator to get up to your place in a tall building. Are you allowed to have a non-Jew take you up to that spot? And I said, my answer to that was yes, you are allowed to. You don't need a special Shabos elevator if you are able to have an agreement with, let's say, somebody in the building, a non-Jewish person that works there, who will help you get up to your apartment that you're renting. That would be perfectly acceptable. The reason why is because using the elevator is really only a rabbinic issue. At most, using most powered items is only rabbinic and not a Torah level issue, and therefore requesting that a non-Jew do this for you, before Shabbos and have it for every week is acceptable. So, cool stuff. Now let's go to some of the questions that are here in the chat. Question is, what does Judaism say about motivation Is fear-driven observance valid? Is it still meaningful to God? Well, the one who actually answers this statement most obviously is Maimonides, the Rambam. And the Rambam himself talks about this in a few different places. He talks about this in Hilchos Shuvah. He talks about this in Mada, and he talks about people who are Oved Me'ava, Oved Me'ira. So at the end of Hilchos Shuvah, he talks about people who serve out of fear versus people who serve out of love. He says serving out of love is something that is such a high and important place to get to. That's what you feel you're most connected to it. It's the most sincere, and that's what you try to get to. Now, serving out of fear means you'll abstain from doing anything wrong, but that's not what God's looking for. He wants you to appreciate what's being done. So if you're just simply afraid of the punishment, you'll kind of do what I like to call a halachic obstacle course. And I read an excellent article about this from a gentleman, professor, I don't think it was a Rav, Moshe Koppel, some 15 years ago, and it was called, you can find it online, called A Letter to My Son. Beautiful little letter, and it's a lot of Rabbanim over the course of time have written letters to their children as like a testament to faith, and he talks about not viewing Judaism as an obstacle course, and he speaks about that very, very eloquently. And even though it's mentioned in a number of other places, I felt that his way of describing it as an obstacle course would resonate a little bit better with people who have more experience with sort of modern intonations. It's not for you simply to use it as an intellectual exercise to see how you can get around it. And that's a statement that's not made or found emphatically in earlier works. And I think that's a very important point, that it emphasizes what the Rambam is talking about. The person invests their entire person into this, and in some ways it seems that they are almost obsessive about it. And one should, so the converse of that is to be sort of withdrawn and not connected to it. This should permeate everyone's entire experience of avoda, their entire experience of service. I do things because they are meaningful. I do things because they are purposeful, and because they are something that's important to me. So that is how I would wrap that up. And yes, it's also still meaningful to Hashem as well. Okay. Next question: what happens when you die? Well, I don't know. I've never done that. So I'm not speaking from personal experience. Now, so this question is actually addressed in a wonderful work by the Ramban called Shar HaGamul. He addresses what that looks like. It's also addressed in the Shar HaGilgulim of the Ari, and it's also addressed in the Shar HaTshuva. Shar HaTshuva. There's a gate of redemption and resurrection. Resurrection for Rav Saji Gaon. And it's interesting to just sort of see how this plays out differently through different periods of Jewish history. The rationalist school of Jewish thought, which permeated a lot of Sephardic Jewry, Babylonian Jewry, did not believe in a reincarnation whereby one is reincarnated into like an animal or some type of other Gilgul. Gilgul is a form of reincarnation, but not reanimation or resuscitation of the dead. And it's important to distinguish between that. Maimonides doesn't talk about it, about being reincarnated or brought back again. The one gadol who does speak about it in great detail is the Vilna Gaon. In his commentary on Yonah, he's very specific about how Yonah is an analogy for getting sort of that second chance on your life experience. Idea that you've lived your life and its end becomes very tumultuous because of all of the great and many sins that have been attached to it. But the idea is that the neshama, the soul itself, comes back and wants to do better, and therefore it comes back and sees itself as in a process of tshuva, of doing better the next time. So the Vilna Gaon talks about this at great length in that commentary, and he's quoting mostly from sources in the Zohar, and it's actually very telling that this type of belief system is very absent from the rabbis who lived before the 16th century when the Zohar pops up, because it's not really found in rabbinic literature. So it shows up later. And so it's hard to say what really is, because a lot of these belief systems originate in thought systems that didn't originate with Chazal. So it's hard to know what happens, but there we speculate. Okay, next question. Someone asked the question. So converting to Judaism is a personal experience, and I don't want to talk to people who know nothing about it. So having not completed conversion, how do you navigate pre-existing emotional and romantic attachments? And what if children are a result of this romantic union? Someone made a very good point here in the Ask the Rabbi chat about once converted, we are instructed that that our physicality has been altered. We are no longer descended from our genealogical ancestry to such an extent that a man could even marry his own mother if such a thing were not lawful in his country, which it is not. Okay, and by the way, it's also rabbinically prohibited. Okay. Is a convert expected to resign from genealogical association, like Daughters of the American Revolution, which use family trees for registry, or at least decline to apply for new membership? If before conversion we were the family genealogist, do we resign from that activity? Are we intended to now think of our original family as just the people who raised us? So all these questions all tie into one very important thing, which is we know that conversion is a process of starting anew, but you're not totally a new person. So it's very interesting. There was a question posed to Rabbi Chaim Yair back in the 16th century. The question was, a person who converts is trying to get out of some of their debts. So the question was, once he converts, what does this mean that they can no longer be approached for their debts? Are they really a new person, that the other person doesn't exist? Or do the debts still attach while these familial attachments are all broken? And he explains very eloquently that the only thing that really changes economically is that if there were an outstanding loan on this person, you could collect from them, but just if you had put any interest into the contract can no longer be interest bearing once they convert, which means that it's the monetary obligation still attaches, and you can still demand the money from them, but their whole familial attachment is gone. And he says it's puzzling because we constantly make the statement of a convert is like one who was born brand new, but the idea is that they're not really a different thing. They are still the same being, just with different status. So he differentiates between a personal status and physical status. So you are still the same physical person. So you could, like you pointed out, you still are cognizant of where you came from, but you're not a brand new being that started over again. You still have all of your original attachments to your same person, but your familial ones are now considered as not being viable anymore. So, and because people have basically said, even in the laws of B'nai Noach, even the laws given to Noah for the non-Jewish world, it should still prohibit things like incest and so on. But once you convert, those things no longer are restricted as a Torah mandate, but only as a rabbinic mandate. And it appears that that's the case when to demonstrate that when one becomes an observant Jewish person, they are no longer tied to their ancestry. They are now a new group of people. They are part of the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so therefore, it requires that they no longer become tied to their previous ancestry. However, certain groups were still attached to it. So, for example, from Ammon and Moab, you were, for 3 generations, you bear the name Ammoni, Moabi, even though you had converted to Judaism. And then you were not permitted to mix with the Jewish people until after that time. And Mitzri and Adumi, and also the Egyptians and the Idumeans were not permitted to marry into the Jewish people. And so therefore, that would have been a problem if they were mixing in. So it would have been an issue had they basically said that so at a certain point, some of these prohibitions don't fall off, and some of them do. So you see, there's some ancestral ties still left in after. So that's basically kind of it. Now the question about in terms of your other attachments that are pre-existing. So, for example, if someone, let's say a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman had children, the children are not credited towards the father. And I've had this conversation with people before. One guy called me up and he said, "Listen, I had a kid. I'm having a kid with my girlfriend, with my wife, with my whatever you want to call the other person, and we want to name them after a deceased family member, right?" And I said, "Well, it's not an honor to them. You're having a child with a non-Jewish woman." I said, "That's a Torah prohibition. There's no honor in that." I said, "You need to, wait until we find somebody who's Jewish, and then you can honor that." And so, because why? Because there's no descendancy in prohibited relationships. They're not considered a descendant. And some people argue about this. If someone had a child that was, for example, a mamzer, a child that was out of a prohibited illicit relationship, like with a relative, an incestuous one, or with a married woman, these are that is another form of descendancy. But some people say that you might be credited with having had children, since the child would still be Jewish in those cases. But here, where the child is not Jewish, no credit. But the reality is there are some emotional attachments. The question is, do those have to be ended? So we see clearly from the book of Ezra that they felt that there was no reason to maintain some of those attachments. But as time went on, flash forward, let's say the times of Maimonides, and even before that, if these other women and these children that were born of them wish to accept as binding upon themselves the Torah of Moshe, we certainly accept them. And so one of the challenges into modern times that people felt that they could just culturally identify as Jewish without having any of the responsibilities of the legal aspect of it, such as you have to keep Shabbos, you have to keep kosher, and if you don't keep Shabbos and you don't keep kosher, you get attached to punishments for those things. So those are an integral part of it. So in many ways, there's been a lot of flexibility in that aspect of it. There wasn't the very strict, you must go away and not come back, which seems to have been even in the times of the Talmud. But there seemed to have been some leniency that had developed throughout history as a result of having these emotional attachments. So there has to be a clear line drawn that, if we're going to keep this going together, everyone's going to have to be observant. Everyone's going to have to keep the Torah and to follow the mitzvos. So those are all an integral part of that aspect. Okay. Let's see over here. Someone asked a question: is sister wives a permitted practice in Orthodox Judaism? And so his question was, he explained after learning that you can't marry two sisters, that is having more than one wife a permitted practice in Orthodox Judaism, okay, in terms of permitted relations. So is that permitted, or is that not? So, and by the way, if anyone has a question who's watching, who's in the chat, feel free to go ahead and drop your questions in live. Okay, so we'll go ahead and answer those if you have any other questions. Where am I over here? Okay, so that's an interesting question. So there's actually a dispute between Ashkenazi and Sephardic poskim. So famously, everyone is aware of something known as the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. That at some time in the 9th century, Rabbeinu Gershom, who was the greatest rabbi of his generation, his beit din, his court, made some enactments for the Ashkenazi communities, and apparently also for the Sephardic communities of Europe. And he apparently this was accepted as binding upon many communities, which is interesting because we find no evidence of anybody else having such a powerful basin other than Ravina Ravashi, which goes back to the 7th century, as being binding on everybody. Because even stuff that was being decided by the Gaonim after them was not considered binding upon all Jewish people. So it was a fascinating decision of this Beis Din to prohibit several things. One of them was to take one wife in addition to one's already existing wife. It's a dispute whether or not this cherem, this ban, extended past the sixth, into the 6th millennium, meaning in the year and beyond the year 5000. So going back over 700 years ago. So that basically impacted our good friends who lived in the 14th century. So that experience was basically to say that it's entirely possible that the Rabbeinu Gershom only made the Gezerah until the end of his own millennia, until 4,999 years from creation. But at the beginning of the sixth millennia, which is the year 5,000, the ruling was that it ended. So the Ashkenazi world, I mean the German world that existed, and in French world, and so on and so forth, it did not come to an end. And in the Sephardic world, apparently it did come to an end. So the Sephardic world made an adjustment. They basically required at every marriage ceremony that you make an agreement not to take a wife upon your wife without her permission. So why did they do that? So the reason why they had to make a conditional statement like that is because you're not allowed to write contracts in which you put statements in the contract that would be binding upon you against what the Torah permits to you, because this is not employment. This is a lien and a loan contract, and therefore it's only prohibited unless she doesn't consent to it. So you can't, against her will, take another one, and if you do, you owe her all types of penalties and so on and so forth. So that's written into the Sephardic ketubah, and one has to do all these little fun things when writing, when accepting a Sephardic ketubah, in order to make the money of the ketubah binding upon you. It's very interesting legal class, and I believe if you look up my class on ketubah, you'll see I have a class on asmachta and ketubah in the YouTube channel. So if you look that up, you'll see an explanation about what that all is and why it functions that way. And it's an hour-long class, so if you are really interested in it, it will be available for you. The interesting thing about it is, so that's the Sephardic practice. So in order to make it binding, you have to do things that demonstrate you understand the terms and that this is a true legal binding contract. For Ashkenazim, it's just the reality, and it has never changed, and therefore one who's Ashkenazi cannot do that. So that is the answer to that question. Do we have any other questions I would like to address for the class? Okay, well, if there's nothing else that we'd like to address for now, we can go ahead and wait for the next time that we are having class and address those questions at that time. But thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon here. And you have a question? Go ahead. I'll wait for you. Okay, when a married Jewish couple makes Aliyah, do they have to prove their ancestry to be accepted as married in Israel? Converts have to submit a review of their information. Okay, so so basically what happens is that everybody has to, when you make Aliyah to the modern state of Israel, you have to submit documentations documenting that you are Jewish. So very similar to similar as a convert. People have to provide a letter from the rabbi of their synagogue that they are Jewish. Sometimes they have to, if they aren't attached to synagogue, then they have to bring other proofs that they are Jewish. And so basically the further you are away from the synagogue, and the further you are away from the big established and well-recognized Jewish communities, the harder it is to make Aliyah. So they've been clamping down on it more and more, and they may actually do away with certain aspects of the law of return because of the fact that there's been a lot of people who are basically not Jewish that are coming into Israel under the law of return. Now, that's always been the case since 1950, that people can make Aliyah to Israel and not be Jewish. But the question is, what color document do they get? I was actually talking to somebody today where I was saying that there are people who are literally not Jewish who are being listed as Jewish in the records of the Rabbanut, and it's something that needs to be rectified. It's not rampantly a problem, but it is a common problem. So because you're supposed to have special documents that identify you as Jewish, and in Israel you have both the ketubah and a get, meaning you've at least been married or have been divorced, and therefore those documents are used as evidence for that case. So you can use those same ones outside the land of Israel to come to Israel to evidence that, and that's something unique to the land of Israel today. The problem is that they don't like doing reviews. So if they don't recognize the names outright, then they'll send it to the Beit Din to review the documentation. And that seems to be the only time. The only time they really reject anything is if, number one, someone's just really not in a good mood and doesn't want to deal with something, and they'll do that. Then that requires, every so often they'll have to have some issues. But the main thing is to actually, if you are struggling, there's other organizations like Sohar that do a better job than the Rabbanut of reviewing your case if you're finding that the Rabbanut is not being helpful. So, or you can just start at something like Sohar or Etim. Although I recommend Sohar, Rav Stav and the people who work with him. He's the chief rabbi of Shoham, have a much more organized organization than other places in and around. Or you can visit the Rabbanut offices. But again, they have a better staff than some of these places. I used to hear things like, only go on Tuesdays, or don't go on Tuesdays. Tuesdays is the mean person who wants to just reject everything. So, normal bureaucratic stuff. So that's what's required in making Aliyah. Any other questions before we end today's session? All right. Take a quick look at the top of the chat. And let's see. All right. All right, then we will call it a day. Thank you, everyone, again for coming. And we'll see you again next time. Have a wonderful day.